Okay, so let us continue our discussion on God. In the last video, we talked about love and how it is in contradiction with eternal hell and how it leads to a universalist approach, which would mean that every single creature that exists will eventually be united with God. Now, but obviously, there is a question of this delay that exists before where we are right now and heaven, basically. So, why is it that we're not in heaven already? And that is the foundation for the problem of evil. Because if we were in heaven, then we would not be suffering at all. So the reason that we're not in heaven is actually the condition upon which the problem of evil can happen. So understanding this gap that exists between where we are right now and heaven, and why is it there, is basically the foundation for the problem of evil. If you want to understand that problem, we need to understand this gap. All right, so why the delay? Why is it that we're not already in that state of union with God? Now, this might look like as if it's a very difficult question, and it is a difficult question because we're trying to understand the process of creation, how we are being created, and basically why God is creating, or trying to understand the whole process of creation, to understand why is it that this phase is somehow necessary for us to go through before we get into that state of heaven. And I say that it is necessary because if it were not necessary, then it would mean that this vulnerability that we have toward all the suffering and pain is not something necessary for us to get into heaven. These things will be just unnecessary suffering thrown at us by God. And that, I believe, is uncontroversial, that is in conflict with God being love. So I'm just going to assume that this phase that we are at right now is something necessary for us to get into heaven. Or in other words, heaven is not yet possible for us to get into. And that's what's leading to all the sufferings that we are experiencing right now. So it's important to understand what it is about this phase that we are at right now, between where we are right now and heaven, that's necessary for us for the possibility of getting into heaven. So one criteria for judging different candidates as an answer to this question is exactly this fact that whatever it is about this state that we are in, it must be optimized in some respect. It must be minimized in some respect, so we can get to that heavenly state as soon as possible, because obviously it's not time that's been optimized. Because again, otherwise it would be just unnecessary suffering, and that, in my opinion, is in conflict with love. And notice that I'm saying this because some people believe that the world that God created is kind of like an arbitrary choice, like it could have been better, it could have been worse. But if you're serious about the fact that God is love, I don't see how unnecessary suffering for a creature can be squared with the concept of love. So I'm going to assume that God is basically doing its best to reduce all the suffering and get us what's good for us, and that's the union at the end. All right, so what is this state? What is this phase? And why is it necessary? Now, there are different candidates, of course. One of good candidates that comes up a lot is this soul-making theodicy. So the fact that the suffering somehow is necessary for us, that it helps us to gain virtue, and so the place, this state and phase that we are in, is a very good place for us to grow, to gain virtue, and basically to be built until we can get into heaven. So that phase is necessary. Now, even though this idea is built upon a nice idea, which is called the epistemological distance between us and God, you can read more about this on John Hick book about the problem of evil. But I don't think the concept of suffering per se is something that is optimized, that is something that's necessary for us to go through before we get to heaven, the suffering itself. And the reason that I'm saying is, again, that criteria of optimality. Because if you look around, is the suffering that we see in the world optimized in any sense? The distribution that we see for suffering seems to be somehow random. Somehow it depends on where you're born, the financial condition of the family that you're born into. So it doesn't look like to me that the world that we're living in is made for gaining virtues. Because even if you look around, we see actually the opposite is happening, that people are not gaining virtue, because the world that we're living in looks like as if the one who gains virtue is actually the one losing in this world, you know? The world is trying to push you toward being selfish, toward thinking about only yourself, something in the opposite of all the virtues that we talked about. And you need a kind of willpower to exercise to gain those virtues. And someone might say, okay, that's exactly what virtue means, the fact that you have to willfully work on it to gain it. But again, if this is important, if the state that we are in is necessary for us to get that, to get that virtue, if we are here only to get that virtue, if that is the case, then these scenarios should not happen. Because remember, everyone is getting ready to get to that point. Yet some people are living in a way that doesn't live up to that expectations of gaining those virtues. Some people suffer more, some people suffer less, some people choose to grow those virtues, and some people don't. Now, of course, if you have a concept of judgment and eternal hell, then these things might make sense to you, because you say, okay, yeah, it's their decision. If they do good, they would gain heaven. If they not, they would go to hell. But if we don't have that, and if we believe that this phase is necessary for us to get ready to get there, then if you put someone here and they don't gain those virtues, then that's just a failed project. Now, in addition to all these problems, there's also the problem of other creatures. What about other animals? What about plants? Because remember that the way that we talked about it is that this union and this universalist approach is for every single creature. But do they also gain virtue through the suffering? Is that what's happening to them too? And in addition to all of that, as I said, this kind of random distribution bothers me, because it seems like, so if you go 10,000 years ago, it seems that people were in need of a lot more courage, than the people who are right now living in our society. But why is that? Like, why is it that someone who's born into a rich family and enjoys a lot of privileges, they don't need that much growth in virtue? They don't need a lot of suffering to gain virtue. But a child who's born in a poor country, in a poor family, they seems to go through a lot of suffering, a lot of soul making. That distribution does not look optimum to me. So I need to look somewhere else. And as I said, so this whole point of soul making is kind of built on another idea, which I believe is a very good candidate for this state. And that's the distance that exists between God and this world. If we look around, what is it that is optimized with respect to, the God and the relation that God has to this world? And I believe the most obvious thing about this whole discussion is divine hiddenness. It seems this is not a random thing. It seems that God is trying its best to hide. It looks like as if God is as far as possible from this world. God is trying to remove every trace that you can find from God's effect on our universe. Now that is a strange, right? And that's also part of the problem of evil, right? The divine hiddenness problem. Because why is God so hidden? Why is he hiding so much? The only way that we can actually show, and if you go through the videos, you can see this, the only way that we could actually show that there is a God was only based on some technicalities, some technical issues regarding to the fact that there is something rather than nothing, and why do we have something the way that they are. And that was how we got to the existence of God. It was not an obvious thing. It's not like that you look around and you say, oh, come on, it's obvious that there is a God. It's not actually obvious at all. For all practical reasons, we can actually be an atheist because we don't need God anywhere in our universe. You don't need God to explain anything in our universe. If we just get over that little bit of technicality in regarding to the existence and principle of sufficient reason, if you start from not the bottom, not trying not to get to the like really bottom, dive deep, but to start just one step above that from some brute facts, then we don't need God at all to explain anything after that. And that's something that I believe it's designed, it's optimized deliberately. And also notice that I said as far as possible, because we cannot have God completely cut off from this world, because God by definition is the act of existence. And so if we want to exist, there must be a touching point between us and that act of existence. Otherwise we wouldn't exist by definition. So it seems to me that God is connected, but God is as far as possible. So this world, we can call it the worst possible world, in a sense of the distance that exists between God and us. And that perfectly sums up the situation that we're in. God is barely touching our world and is not affecting it in any other way. And that's the states that we are in. And we can see how that state just leads to all the chaos and pain and suffering that we see around us. Of course, the question is still there, that why is it that this thing exists? Why is it that it's necessary for us to live in such a state of distance from God for the heaven to become possible for us? That's the main question that I will explain in other videos. But in this video, I just want to focus on this suggestion that we might be living in the worst possible world. In a world where we are as far as possible from God. God is barely touching our universe. So in this case, I'm actually more inclined toward, I'm not an atheist, but I'm just saying that practically I'm more inclined toward atheism. Because it looks to me that there is no place for God in our universe. We don't need God. And that's actually a very good reason to not believe in God. And that's the approach that atheists such as Graham Oppy take. That we really don't need God. Like adding God to the equations doesn't add that much to our understanding of the world, and that's completely true. And even if you get really engaged with these arguments, you will find out that it's very difficult to prove God beyond like a shadow of doubt. There's always these gaps. There is something always like lurking behind those arguments. You can always find a way out of them. Now, to me, that's something designed. That's not a kind of random thing. It's not distributed randomly. Either there is no God, and that's a good explanation too, which I don't believe, because again, I believe if you really get technical, if you really look closely, you will see some traces that even though God is trying its best to remove those traces, you can still see something there. So either there is no God, which I don't believe it is, or there is a God, but he is trying his best to stay hidden. So yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to say about the problem of evil for this part. Of course, the most interesting question right now still remains: why is that necessary? Why is God's being hidden is necessary for us to get into heaven? And that's something that I will discuss in the next video. Cheers.